The Hancock Park mansion, once owned by Myrna Loy, has long been a source of fascination and unease for its subsequent owners and curious passersby. Nestled among stately trees, its elegant facade belies a series of eerie occurrences that have given the property an enigmatic reputation. The house's current owners, the Callahans, purchased it in 2015, charmed by its Art Deco architecture and storied Hollywood history. However, from the moment they moved in, strange things began to happen. On their first night, as they were unpacking, they heard faint notes from a piano echoing through the halls. Startled, they searched every room but found no instrument. As days turned into weeks, the piano's melody, a haunting, slow tune that seemed to come from another era, became a regular occurrence. It was always faint, as if played from a distant room, and often accompanied by an unsettling silence that blanketed the house before it started. One particularly chilling event occurred in late autumn. Mrs. Callahan was gardening in the front yard when a neighbor approached her. "Does one of your daughters like to sit by the window upstairs?" the neighbor asked, pointing toward the second-floor window that overlooked the street. Mrs. Callahan, puzzled, replied, "No, my children are at school." The neighbor's face turned pale. "I just saw a woman standing there, dressed in what looked like 1930s clothing. She was staring at me." When Mrs. Callahan went inside to check, the room was empty. The window, however, was slightly ajar, letting in a draft that carried with it the faint scent of lavender, Myrna Loy's signature fragrance, as the Callahans later discovered from a vintage interview. Curious and increasingly unnerved, the Callahans delved into the history of the house. They learned that Myrna Loy was not only a glamorous actress but also a deeply private person who loved playing the piano to unwind. While the house's current layout no longer includes a music room, records showed that one had been located on the first floor, a room now converted into a study. Visitors to the house have also reported seeing the woman at the window. Some describe her as graceful and serene, her silhouette bathed in soft light. Others claim to feel a sense of unease, as if being watched. The Callahans considered selling the mansion but eventually decided to stay, embracing its quirks and mysteries. They've grown accustomed to the piano music and have even left a vintage metronome on a shelf in the study, claiming it seems to comfort whoever or whatever might be lingering. To this day, the woman at the window remains a topic of speculation. Is it Myrna Loy herself, revisiting a place she once called home? Or is it a projection of the house's storied past, forever imprinted in its walls? Visitors to the house leave with more questions than answers, often glancing back at the second-floor window, half expecting to see a figure standing there, watching them depart. One winter evening, as the Callahans settled in for the night, Mr. Callahan noticed something odd. On the study's desk sat an old, leather-bound journal he didn't recognize. Its cover was slightly cracked, its edges worn, as if it had been touched by many hands over the decades. He called out to his wife, but she insisted she had never seen it before. Curiosity got the better of them, and they opened the journal. The first few pages were blank, but as they turned further, faint words began to appear, written in an elegant, looping script. At first, they could only make out fragments: melody, stillness, and regret. Then, more clearly, a chilling line emerged. "To the one who plays, the truth will reveal itself." The Callahans exchanged nervous glances. They searched the journal for more, but the remaining pages were blank once again. The next morning, the journal was gone. Unable to shake the message, the Callahans decided to investigate further. They reached out to a local historian who specialized in the estates of old Hollywood. The historian revealed something astonishing. Before the house had been remodeled, the piano room had a peculiar feature: a concealed passageway hidden behind a sliding panel. This passage supposedly led to a small, private alcove Myrna had used to retreat from the pressures of fame. Intrigued, the Callahans searched the study, tapping on walls and examining corners. Finally, with a faint click, they discovered a section of the wooden paneling that slid open to reveal a narrow staircase leading down to what appeared to be a forgotten part of the house. The hidden room was small, lined with faded wallpaper and filled with dust. At its center stood an old upright piano, its surface tarnished but its keys pristine, as if untouched by time. A faint imprint of a hand, delicate and small, was visible in the dust on the lid. Mrs. Callahan approached cautiously and lifted the lid. The piano, though impossibly old, appeared to be in perfect tune. The moment she pressed a key, the air grew heavy, and the faint smell of lavender wafted through the room. A draft blew through, extinguishing the flashlight they had brought. Then, faintly, the sound of a voice low and melodic filled the air. It wasn't coming from the piano but seemed to emanate from the very walls of the room. "Do you know the song?" the voice whispered. Mrs. Callahan froze, her hand trembling over the keys. She couldn't respond, but the melody she had heard so many nights before began playing faintly, as if inviting her to join. As Mrs. Callahan sat frozen before the piano, the melody began to take on an eerie clarity, almost as if the instrument itself were playing. The soft notes filled the room, reverberating against the walls, and yet there was no visible player. The air felt charged with a strange energy, the temperature dropping noticeably. She looked around the dim room, but the shadows seemed to move, flickering, undulating, as though they were alive. In a moment of desperation, Mr. Callahan grabbed his wife's arm, pulling her away from the piano. "We need to go," he whispered urgently, but his voice sounded muffled, as though the room itself were swallowing the sound. But as they turned to leave, something caught Mrs. Callahan's eye, a reflection in the cracked mirror on the far wall. At first, it seemed nothing more than a trick of the light, but then she saw it distinctly. A woman, standing just behind them. She was dressed in an elegant gown from the 1930s, her features ghostly pale, with a sorrowful expression on her face. The woman's eyes were locked on Mrs. Callahan, and for a fleeting moment, she felt an overwhelming sense of recognition, like she knew this woman, as if she had seen her before in the house. "Did you see that?" Mrs. Callahan gasped. Mr. Callahan turned quickly, but the figure had vanished. The room was empty once more, save for the oppressive silence that hung between them. That night, after returning to the main house, the Callahans discovered something impossible. The journal had reappeared, placed carefully on their kitchen counter, as if it had been waiting for them. The pages now contained a full paragraph, written in the same elegant script. "The melody calls to those who seek the past, but the price is more than you can afford. The truth lies within, but it will never set you free." The couple stared at the journal, both intrigued and terrified by its cryptic words. The journal seemed to be warning them, but of what? What truth lay hidden beneath the house? And why had it been so carefully concealed in the first place? They spent the night in restless sleep, haunted by the melody that had continued to play in their minds, even after they had left the hidden room. The next morning, they decided to return to the piano room. This time, they would uncover whatever secret it was hiding, no matter the cost. When they arrived at the hidden room once more, the atmosphere was different. The air seemed thick, laden with an expectation they couldn't shake. As Mrs. Callahan moved toward the piano, she noticed something new. The sheet music neatly placed on the piano stand was unmistakably old, yellowed and frayed at the edges. The music was handwritten in a flowing, unfamiliar script. She reached for it, her heart racing. The title at the top read, "The Last Song of Myrna." Her fingers trembled as she began to read the first few notes, but as soon as she touched the page, the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. The piano keys, as though of their own accord, began to play louder now, a chaotic, dissonant tune that made Mrs. Callahan's skin crawl. And then, a voice, this time louder, more commanding, rang out in the darkness, the words piercing through the notes of the piano. "You shouldn't have come back." Mrs. Callahan's breath caught in her throat. She turned to Mr. Callahan, but before she could say anything, the room seemed to shift, the walls bending inwards. The air was now thick with the scent of lavender and dust. Shadows stretched unnaturally, reaching for them, as if the house itself were alive, watching them. In that moment, Mrs. Callahan understood. The house, the music, the woman Myrna Loy herself had not been trying to communicate with them. She had been trying to warn them, to keep them away from the truth buried deep within the walls. But it was too late. The melody grew louder, more insistent, drowning out everything else. The room began to fade into a haze, and the woman's figure appeared once again, standing just beyond the doorway. This time, her face was different. Her eyes filled with an emptiness that sent a chill down Mrs. Callahan's spine. "You've already seen too much," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible over the music. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the piano went silent. The room was plunged back into a suffocating stillness, and the woman was gone. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The silence that followed felt suffocating, thick with a sense of foreboding. The Callahans stood motionless in the center of the hidden room, unsure whether to move or speak. The air felt wrong, heavier somehow, as though the very fabric of the house had shifted around them. They glanced at each other, their hearts racing in synchrony. Did you hear her?" Mrs. Callahan whispered, her voice trembling. She said we've seen too much." Mr. Callahan nodded, but his expression was one of deep concern. "That woman, she wasn't just a ghost. That was Myrna Loy, wasn't it?" But he stopped, as if trying to piece together the fragments of what they had just experienced. How could she be here still? What are we dealing with? They turned toward the piano, hoping to find some rational explanation for the events that had just unfolded. But as they approached, they noticed something even more unsettling. The sheet music had vanished, as had the journal. It was as though the house had reclaimed them, pulling them into some hidden realm beyond their understanding. A cold breeze stirred, and Mrs. Callahan shivered, feeling a prickle of unease crawl up her spine. "We need to leave. Now!" But as they turned to exit the room, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping them inside. The walls seemed to pulse as though alive, their surface rippling with an unnatural energy. The temperature plummeted, and a low hum began to vibrate through the air, like the sound of a distant, long-forgotten engine coming to life. A figure appeared before them, emerging from the darkness in the far corner of the room. At first, it was just a silhouette, but as it moved closer, the details began to materialize. It was the same woman, Myrna Loy, only now her presence seemed more oppressive, less ethereal. Her features were sharper, her eyes cold and distant. She stood there silently, staring at them, as if waiting for something to unfold. Mrs. Callahan's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the expression on Myrna's face. It wasn't just sorrow, but something darker, something more desperate. I don't understand," Mr. Callahan stammered. "What do you want from us?" Myrna's lips parted slightly, but it wasn't her voice that spoke. It was the same whisper from earlier, only now it felt more insistent, more commanding. The words crawled into their minds, seeping through their thoughts like an invasive presence. "You're not meant to be here. You never were." The hum grew louder, vibrating through their bones. The room began to distort again, and the walls seemed to blur, as though reality itself were bending. The floor under their feet pulsed like a heartbeat, and then, for a moment, everything seemed to hold its breath. The world seemed to shift, and then suddenly they weren't in the room anymore. They stood in a different place, a different time. The Callahans found themselves in what looked like a dimly lit drawing room, furnished in the style of the 1930s. There was a faint scent of jasmine in the air, and an antique piano stood in the corner. Myrna Loy stood before them, her features softened, her face a mask of melancholy. She appeared real, alive even, as though they had been transported into her very past. "Where are we?" Mrs. Callahan whispered, unsure whether she was dreaming or witnessing something far more sinister. Myrna smiled softly, but the sadness in her eyes only deepened. "This was my home," she said, her voice carrying a strange reverence. "But it was never truly mine. It belongs to something older, something that cannot be outrun." The room seemed to pulse with a low, mournful tune. Mrs. Callahan looked toward the piano, where the keys were moving, playing themselves once more. The melody was the same, the one she had heard countless times, but now it was distorted, warped, like a song played in reverse. "You must understand," Myrna continued, her voice barely audible over the eerie melody. This house, this melody, was never meant for me. It is a doorway. Before she could finish, a sudden flash of light erupted from the piano, blinding them. Mrs. Callahan tried to shield her eyes, but it was too late. The room began to spin, faster and faster, until they were once again engulfed by darkness. When the light faded, the Callahans found themselves back in the hidden room, but something had changed. The piano was silent, and the air no longer felt oppressive, yet the atmosphere was thick with an unsettling presence. Myrna's figure was gone, but the feeling of her watchful gaze lingered. They could hear the faint echo of the melody, still playing in the distance, but now it was no longer a haunting tune. It was a warning, a call to something ancient and powerful, something that had waited for years, hidden in the depths of the house. Mrs. Callahan turned to her husband, her face pale. We need to leave now. We've awakened something that doesn't want us here. But as they approached the door once more, it slowly creaked open on its own. A cold wind swept through, and in the doorway stood the woman again, her figure bathed in a ghostly light. The price has already been paid, she whispered, and with that the door slammed shut behind them. The door slammed shut with a force that reverberated through the entire room, as though the house itself were sealing them in. Mrs. Callahan and her husband stood frozen in the oppressive darkness, the weight of the moment settling around them like a suffocating fog. The piano, which had been eerily silent just moments before, now seemed to beckon them with an unearthly presence, the faint sound of keys pressing in rhythmic succession reverberating through the walls. You have to stop," Mrs. Callahan whispered, her voice trembling. "We can't stay here any longer." But Mr. Callahan stood still, his gaze fixed on the shadowed corner where Myrna had appeared. There was something in the air now, something deeper than fear. It was an understanding, one they had both been avoiding. The house, the piano, the melody, it was all part of a cycle they had unwittingly become part of. As the music swelled in intensity, it felt as though the very walls of the room were alive, moving with the tempo of the melody. The sound no longer felt distant. It was surrounding them, pressing in on them from every angle. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of lavender, the same scent that had followed them since their first encounter. And then they saw it, the reflection in the cracked mirror on the wall. This time it wasn't just Myrna standing in the corner, but a multitude of figures, each one different, each one from a different era, but all of them staring directly at the Callahans. The faces were a blur, the features distorted as if caught between worlds. Myrna's voice echoed softly from the shadows. This house has been waiting for someone like you to finally unlock the truth." Mrs. Callahan's heart raced as she spun to face her husband, her voice now desperate. "We have to leave. This is not a place for the living." But before they could make a move, the mirror cracked, and the shadows spilled out, their figures flickering as though they were pulling at the very fabric of the room. The melody grew louder, drowning out everything else. The walls trembled with the energy of the sound, and then the piano began to play, its lid slamming open with a sudden force. The music was no longer haunting, it was primal, raw, a summons. With a final glance at the door, the Callahans rushed toward it, but it slammed shut with an inhuman force as though the house was locking them inside forever. The walls seemed to close in on them, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that their breath came out in visible clouds. And then, as if the house had swallowed them whole, they were plunged into darkness. When the Callahans' bodies were finally found, weeks later, it was as though they had simply vanished, leaving no trace of their presence. The mansion stood in silence, its windows dark, its once echoing piano now mute. The house remained, waiting once more for the next curious soul to step across its threshold. And to this day, those who pass by the mansion late at night sometimes hear the faint sound of an old piano, a melody both beautiful and sorrowful, coming from within. The stories of the Callahans, of Myrna Loy, and of the haunted house in Hancock Park continue to whisper through the streets, carried by the wind like a forgotten song waiting, always waiting, for someone to listen. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.